What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. Have you ever been wearing a pair of shoes that are just one size too small? How comfortable is that for you? Well, the same goes for your plants. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how to know when it's time to transplant your plants so they're not living in a shoe size that's one too small. Now, different plants have different needs, and we're going to talk about that because lettuce is going to be a whole lot different than, say, a tomato, and a tomato is going to be a whole lot different than, say, a houseplant. But we're going to cover all of those in today's episode. So with that being said, let's go. All right, so first we're going to talk about vegetative and fruiting crops. There's kind of three main categories we're going to talk about. Vegetative being anything you're harvesting for the foliage or the vegetation, like lettuce or kale. Then there is fruiting crops, which are like tomatoes, peppers, anything you're growing for fruit. And then there are houseplants. Now, vegetative and fruiting both share kind of the similarity with when they're ready to be transplanted. The first thing you want to look for is you want to look for the roots coming out of the bottom of the cell pack. Those little drainage holes, you should have drainage holes in your containers if you're growing right, but the drainage holes in the bottom of the cell packs should start to have roots kind of poking out the bottom. This is the equivalent of you putting on a pair of shoes and someone saying, wiggle your big toe. Well, if you wiggle your big toe and you see your toe kind of popping through the end of the shoe, it's probably too small. And so that is kind of your foot busting out of the shoe saying, I need a bigger shoe size. And plants, they don't have toes, but they do have root tips. And the root tips are like the toes, and they're saying, it's time to move to a bigger container. And so both vegetative as well as fruiting crops share in that same similarity. The big difference is with houseplants. So we're going to talk about how you know when it's time to transplant a houseplant. Now, let's go. All right, so now we're going to talk about houseplants. So houseplants differ a lot from vegetative and fruiting plants. You see, we talked about how when vegetative and fruiting plants are kind of poking their roots through the bottom of the drainage holes, it's time to transplant. That's not the case with houseplants. A lot of times with houseplants, you want to keep the pot size really small. We talked about this in our houseplant, the video that we did about houseplants and mistakes that people make when growing houseplants. And one of those mistakes was putting them in too large of a pot. And that basically means you don't want to transplant it into a larger pot until it really, really needs it. You'll see here this aloe, try not to spill too much soil, this aloe is getting really root bound. That's the process of the roots wrapping around and around and around. And what you'll notice is that there's still probably about 75% of the soil, the volume of this pot is still soil and not roots. The ratio that a lot of people say is pretty generally accepted is around 50%. That means if this pot holds a cup of soil, you want about a half a cup of roots. Now again, you can't measure roots necessarily, but when you pull it out of the pot, you can kind of see just about, how much roots can you see versus how much soil can you see. Now, the old question that always gets asked is, where does the soil go? Well, believe it or not, the plant actually consumes it. It's crazy, but as the soil breaks down and weathers and degrades, the plant will actually consume it. The roots actually break it down. And so the soil kind of just disappears. And so when you're looking at house plants, again, you just want to look at 50% of the available volume of the soil should be roots before it's time to transplant. Again, look at like this staghorn fern. Look how giant this plant is in this teeny tiny little half-gallon pot. I mean, this thing is absolutely incredible. I'm not going to pull this one out here because it's, there's not even roots coming out the bottom. This could literally live in here for another probably 2 years before it even needs to be transplanted. And that's because the roots grow very small, very slowly, and the roots are fairly small on a staghorn fern. Compare that to one of these rubber trees here. These rubber trees, pull this out gently. The roots are really thick on a rubber tree. But look at all this soil. The roots are down at the very bottom. You can kind of see the roots kind of popping out the bottom there. But there's hardly any roots up at the top. And so, there we go, kind of put that back gingerly there. But you'll see the amount of available soil is not even close to being ready to be transplanted yet. And so what you want to do is you want to leave those there until that's ready. And that way you don't overwater, because all that soil is going to hold on to water. And if you add too much soil, there's too much water, and houseplants don't like too much water. So let's go back to vegetative and fruiting plants, and we're going to talk about kind of when to transplant those, or not when to transplant, but how to transplant those, and how to know what size pot is too big. All right, back to fruiting and vegetative crops, because I'm assuming that's probably the one you're going to be growing and going to be transplanting out into your garden, hopefully. So we're going to talk about that one because houseplants are pretty maintenance free. I mean, basically when they're ready to be transplanted, you just move them to a bigger container that's about twice the size that they're in right now, and they're good for like 3 to 5 more years. So you don't have to worry that much about houseplants. But when it comes to fruiting and vegetative crops that you're starting indoors to, say, move out to your garden, they grow very fast, and the roots grow very fast as well. And so it's really important that we accommodate for that fast growth. Now, when you're looking at vegetative crops, you're going to move them into a container that's about 3 times the volume. Prime example, these are in a 1 inch by 1 inch cell. We're going to be moving them into a 3 inch by 3 inch cell. That's roughly 3 times the volume. Now, volume is length times width times height, stuff like that. General rule of thumb is right around 3 times the volume. So we're going to move them from a 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch into about a 3 inch by 3 inch by 3 inch. 3 times the volume. It's that simple. And that way, that's hopefully going to give us enough time to grow this crop basically as long as you need indoors until it's ready to be moved outdoors. That's going to give it enough time because, again, these plants here, once they get established, once the roots start growing, they don't slow down. They just keep going. And so you want to kind of balance. It's a balancing act between too much soil, which leads to root rot and a lot of like mildew and fungus gnats and nastiness because there's just too much soil for the roots to really take up and efficiently use, and then not enough to where you're going to have to transplant again because that's just, I mean, not only are you wasting containers, you're wasting time, you're wasting soil, you're wasting money, and you could just get it right in the first place. So with fruiting or with vegetative crops, 3 times the volume. Now it's a really subtle change, but it's a change that makes all the difference, and that's with fruiting crops. You want to move them into a container that's 4 times the volume. So in this case, if these were a tray of tomatoes, I'd move them from a 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch to a 4 inch by 4 inch by 4 inch. It's very simple. And what's really nice is the greenhouse industry has actually kind of modernized this way of making things simple for you, because a lot of times if you go with a 5 inch pot, it's generally about 5 to 5.5 inches tall and 5 to 5.5 inches wide. And so that volume, when you move from a 1 inch container to a 5 inch container, generally the math adds up. And so very, very simple. Now, again, what happens if you're ready to transplant from, say, a 3 inch pot? Well, from a 3 inch pot, you're going to have to go to a 9 inch pot. And so that's just that. You want to 3x that for vegetative crops. You want to 4x that for fruiting crops until basically you reach a pot that's large enough that you don't have to transplant it anymore. It's at its basically the most soil that it's ever going to need to grow and mature. All right, so now we're going to cover one simple mistake that a lot of gardeners make when transplanting from a smaller container into a bigger container, and that is simply burying their plants too deep. You see these lettuce here, they're not perfect by any means, but we're growing them indoors. The conditions are not ideal for growing plants to their maximum potential, so they occasionally will get a little bit floppy. The lights, though they're very strong, are not as strong as the sun is, and that can sometimes lead to plants that are slightly a little bit floppy. And so the common mistake would be, okay, this plant is ready to be transplanted. Come on, get out of here. There we go. And so you get a plant that's ready to be transplanted. However, even though it's ready to be transplanted, it's still a little floppy. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to take it and bury it too deep, because you might think to yourself, well, I'm going to straighten the stem out. I'm going to bury it deeper, and I'm basically going to fix that wobbliness in the stem by just burying it a little bit deeper. And what that results is crown rot. Now that can happen with absolutely any crop. Doesn't matter if it's lettuce, if it's a pepper, if it's a basil plant, it doesn't matter. The base of the plant needs to stay the base of the plant. You can't just keep moving soil up the stem, because a lot of gardeners just think, well, I'm going to right the plant. I'm going to make it stand up straight, and then it's going to grow better. That's not the case. The only exception, and I say the only exception, is tomatoes. And the only reason why they're an exception to the rule is because they're vines. And vines, they can set roots all along the stem. Your lettuce, not a vine. Your peppers, not a vine. Even vining crops like cucumbers and pumpkins, though they are a vine, they're not the same type of vine. That's why I said the only plant that fits into this is tomatoes, where you can bury it deeper and you'll be fine. Everything else will suffer and will die. And I really want to keep you guys from making that mistake, because these plants are already, probably, I'd say, half of the way there. You're halfway to having a successful plant. Don't kill it off now by making a super simple little mistake. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. We got lots more gardening content coming out. The season is just starting to heat up. As well as comment down below with something you learned, if you learned something. If you think a friend would enjoy this episode, share the love, spread it like seeds, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode. As always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care, guys.